Hello, Andrew Field here. I'm a bookseller and a cartoonist. I've been making some videos about talking about my own schizoaffective disorder and also about sort of accepting the illness. And I have a friend who recently asked about making a video about a poet I mentioned in my second video named Friedrich Holderlin. Friedrich Holderlin, a really famous German poet who also happened to have schizophrenia. Um, and I thought, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So um, today in this video, I'm going to talk about sort of poetry and schizophrenia, and maybe also kind of art and schizophrenia. Um, but I just want to say first that there is no sort of like logical or necessary connection between poetry and schizophrenia, right? Like you can write poetry and write tremendous poetry, and you don't have to have any mental illness whatsoever. You can also have schizophrenia and have no interest in poetry whatsoever. So there's no real like tight connection between the two, but there are some interesting overlaps, and we can talk about that. Um, so what I want to do today is I want to talk about some of those overlaps, and then we can look at some poems by Holderlin, Friedrich Holderlin, and talk about the role that aspects of schizophrenia might have played in his poems. Um, but when we do that, we want to make sure that we're not being reductive, right? We don't want to reduce his poetry to schizophrenia, but we can sort of talk about how certain aspects of the illness might have sort of filtered into his thinking when he was writing his early and his late poetry. So, um, for starters, what are some commonalities between schizophrenia and poetry, or what are some overlaps? How can we think about this in a productive way? Um, so let's start with poetry. What is poetry? Poetry is really the art of figurative thought. So it's thinking in metaphor. That's kind of what the nature of poetry is. And if poetry is the nature of figurative thinking, is an art form that involves figurative thought in stanzas, then you would think possibly that schizophrenia wouldn't be the greatest condition for writing figuratively, because people have argued for a long time now in the schizophrenic literature that schizophrenia is actually tends to make people more literal in their thinking. Um, and I do not have the background to sort of argue against that finding. I know that's sort of been like a long-standing finding in literature, but I do want to push back a little bit against that by saying that metaphors are techniques for discovering or creating strangeness in the world. Um, when you write a metaphor, you're combining two unlike things to create a kind of third thing, you know? And I think that living with a schizophrenia spectrum illness means that you are open in some ways to these forms of strangeness because of your own experience. I mean, your own experience, your own existence seems to favor what we could call like the kind of like uncategorizable, right? Like things that are just sort of strange and different. And, you know, one really well respected definition of literature is that it makes the familiar strange and it makes the strange familiar. So I think that if for people living with schizophrenia spectrum illnesses who have experienced things like auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations and delusions and oscillations in mood and alogia, right, where you can't find the right words, I think poetry as an art form has a lot to offer to that sort of condition because it provides a kind of home for experiencing and thinking about strangeness, and because it allows you to find a voice to express that strangeness, especially if you yourself are struggling with language. Um, and, you know, maybe there's something to say, there's something to be said for metaphor and schizophrenia instead of this constant arguing for people with schizophrenia being just too literal, which I find kind of upsetting. Um, so so what I'm saying is that, you know, people with with the schizophrenia spectrum illness might actually have a sensitivity to language, that we should sort of um, value and emphasize. So another thing about poetry and schizophrenia that seems interesting to me is that poetry is maybe one of the most, I think, abstract art forms that there is. Um, because if you think about it, it's not very, it's sensuous, but it's not, you know, like a painting is sensuous. A painting is, like you can see the one behind me, something you visually see, and it's based on your perception of the painting. But poetry, what you visually see, what you perceive, are just black marks on a white page. But through those black marks, right, you have something that's called mimesis, which is sort of representation. And so poetry is a sort of art of eliciting and soliciting that representation, you know, that imagination. Um, but it's kind of an invisible process in the sense that, like, me and you can look at that painting and sort of comment on it, but if we're reading something, we're commenting on like a kind of invisible representational process that's happening in our minds. um, and I think if you live with with a schizophrenia spectrum illness, I think you also tend to um, veer towards abstraction and theorizing, because I think the illness forces us to think about things in a speculative way because our experience is so different. Um, yeah, there's even a quote that I want to read. Hold on one second. There's a quote by a writer and thinker and scholar named Louis Sass, where he argues that actually many schizophrenics kind of do have an interest in theory and speculation and the uncategorizable because of the nature of our experiences. And he says, from a book called Madness and Modernism, which is my favorite book I've ever read about schizophrenia, he says, many schizophrenics do seem to be highly preoccupied with experiences involving revelations of such cosmic or totalistic proportions about the nature of existence in general or its fundamental relationship to the self. The experiential transformations they experience, right? Because the experiential transformations that we experience often have an all-encompassing quality, affecting not just this or that object, but the look or feel of the entire experiential world. And as schizophrenics disengage from the social and pragmatic world, any focused practical concerns they may have had tend to be replaced by preoccupations of a highly abstract or universal nature. So, when our experience changes and transforms, what else can we do but sort of raise questions about big things like life or existence or the cosmos or thinking or art? And I think poetry also does that in its own way too. Um, yeah. Another overlap that there is between poetry and schizophrenia is this notion of alterity, Alterity. And oftentimes in poems, and this has to do with strangeness, the poem will represent an otherness in the poet, meaning it's as if this voice comes to the poet out of nowhere, speaks its truths, and then vanishes. And it's as if the poet experienced an otherness in his or her own soul. Um, Sometimes you can find this in like a great poet like Wordsworth's poems, where he talks about how this kind of voice embodied by the sound of a river, kind of composes his thoughts, which turns into the poem, the growth of his own mind. Um, Sometimes you might find in Walt Whitman, another great poet, he talks about the hum of your veiled voice, meaning he's talking to his own soul, so it's like, think about how strange that is for a person to talk to his or her own soul. So then what is that chasm between the self and the soul, right? Well, it's kind of an alterity, it's an otherness. um, but I think people living with schizophrenia spectrum illnesses also experience this sense of otherness, this sense of difference, this sense of being a stranger, the sense of being kind of an alien. Sometimes I experience that at work. Sometimes the sense of being an alien, a stranger in the world, and that's something that poetry also talks about. Um, another thing that Another overlap between poetry and schizophrenia spectrum illnesses is when we talk about auditory hallucinations. What we could say with some clarity is that they are kind of a form of mental listening. Oh, there's the thumbs up again. Meaning that when you hallucinate voices, you're not really hearing with your physical ear so much as you're hearing with your mind. And I think poetry too is kind of like a mental listening, meaning you're not hearing the words. If you're reading, you're not hearing the words physically. You're sort of listening to the sounds and meanings of the words. And so it's kind of like a mental listening. And even if you hear a poem being read out loud, which we're going to do soon, um, you hear it physically, but you also experience it kind of semantically. And it's kind of a form of mental listening. So that seems interesting to note. Um, and finally, I think one other overlap between poetry and schizophrenia spectrum analysis is that both are interested in kind of extreme states of mind, or different states of mind, or strange states of mind, or different states of consciousness. Um, because if you are struggling or living with schizophrenia spectrum illnesses, then you know that, like, the experience of a hallucination is a total thing, right? It's not like you just have a thought and it goes away. When you're hallucinating, your whole being is hallucinating. And so it's kind of a different ontology, is what Louis Sass would say. It's a different sort of ontological framework. Um, and I think poetry too is interested in these different states of mind, these reaches of the consciousness, these distances that we traverse in sort of extreme or different states of mind. So we could say that poetry and schizophrenia are also interested in sort of questions about consciousness in a way. Okay, well, having said that, let's look at some poems. So this is Selected Poems and Fragments by Friedrich Holderlin. And Holderlin was a great German poet. He was born in 1770, and he died in 1843. Holderlin was German. I don't know too much about him. He was good friends with the German philosopher Hegel. I know Holderlin was very productive early in his life. I think after he became sick with schizophrenia, he was, I don't know, I mean, I guess hospitalized we could say, but I think there's probably a better word for it, as it was back then. And he lived, I think, the remainder of his life. I believe he was hospitalized, and then he was housed by someone, and he lived the rest of his life housed in this place. Um, but yeah, and he's interesting also because he had schizophrenia, and he's a great poet. Um, there aren't that many poets that I'm aware of that had also a schizophrenia spectrum illness. Some people say that James Schuyler might have had something like that. He's a wonderful American poet. Um, yeah, but in like the sort of pantheon of artists, there aren't that many. I know Agnes Martin, the painter. She had schizophrenia. She's wonderful. Obviously, the dancer Nijinsky did, and his diaries are something that I want to read. They're supposed to be really great. Um, the playwright Antonin Artaud, he had schizophrenia. He's also supposed to be a really great artist. But Holderlin's like a major poet, and he lived with schizophrenia. So I want to read a few poems, and we can ask as we read the poems, not like, why is this, schizophrenic, right? Because even aside from schizophrenia, there's a lot to, not even, aside from talking about schizophrenia, there's an infinite amount of things we can talk about just about the poems as poems. But it's also interesting that he had schizophrenia, so we can talk about that too. So anyways, let's read this. It's called In the Morning. We'll talk about it. And I'll just say one thing to note as we read is the lyricism of the poem, the musicality of it. It's beautiful, and the tones are beautiful. So here it is, In the Morning. And this is a translation by Michael Hamburger, from the German. In the morning. With dew the lawn is glistening. More nimbly now, awake, the stream speeds onward. The beech inclines her limber head, and in the leaves a rustle, a glitter begins. And round the grey cloud banks there a flicker of reddish flames, prophetic ones, flares up and in silence plays. Like breakers by the shore, they billow higher and higher, the ever-changing. Now come, oh come, and not too impatiently, you golden day, speed on to the peaks of heaven. For more familiar and more open, glad one, my vision flies up towards you, while youthful in your beauty you gaze and have not grown too glorious, dazzling and proud for me. Speed as you will, I'd say, if only I could go with you divinely ranging. But at my happy arrogance now you smile, that would be like you rather, than, rambler, bless my mortal acts, and this day also, kindly one, brighten my quiet pathway. So, before we even talk about what it's about, we can just comment about the musicality of the language. And that's a cheap way of putting it, but the beauty of it really, how it's sort of limpid and lucid, like the stream that he describes, and how it moves, and it's sort of its cadences. It's pleasing, it's beautiful, it's satisfying, it's gentle. But it's also interesting that he talks about his vision, and I think that has some bearing upon talking about the poem in the context of schizophrenia-spectrum illnesses. And why is this? Because I think that, I know from my own experience, when I was in something called the prodrome, which is when you start having symptoms but you haven't been diagnosed yet, there's a dreamlike quality to consciousness, where things seem more malleable, really, and things seem less fixed, and it's almost trance-like, really. And I think there's a quality to that in this poem. It's almost dreamlike. Let's read it one more time and we'll talk about it. in the morning. With dew the lawn is glistening. So with dew the lawn is glistening. So there's something about the lawn that seems important to the poet to talk about. And notice that he doesn't say the lawn is glistening with dew. He just says, with dew the lawn is glistening, right? More nimbly now, awake. So we're moving towards a description of nature. The stream speeds onward. The beach, not the beach like the shore, of the sea, but the Beech, the beech tree, inclines her limber head, right? So he's anthropomorphizing the tree. The beech inclines her limber head, and in the leaves a rustle, a glitter begins, right? This is in the morning. And round the gray cloud banks there, a flicker of reddish flames. So behind the clouds there's, or not behind, but around the clouds there's this flicker of reddish flame, right? Think about sunrise, I mean. And the flicker of reddish flame is prophetic one. It's prophetic, right? It's like revelation. It has a religious undertone. Prophetic one flares up and in silence plays. And silence fills this landscape. Like breakers by the shore, they billow the clouds higher and higher, the ever-changing. So already this temporal vision of morning beginning and, morning happening, the happening of morning. And then he says, now, think about that word now. Now come, O come, and not too impatiently. And who is he speaking to? You, golden day. Speed on to the peaks of heaven. So come now, day. For more familiar and more open, glad one, my vision flies up towards you. So is you the day or is you the peaks of heaven? It's not exactly clear. For more familiar and more open. That's a really weird, strange phrasing there. For more familiar and more open, glad one, my vision flies up towards you. Okay, so he has a vision, right? It begins right with the dew. With dew the lawn is glistening. So what is that vision? Well, in a way, it's an intensity of perception, or a sort of sacredness of perception, or fullness or suchness or richness of perception. And it overtakes him. And then he has to, so it's like, well, why did he write this poem? Well, because he's sort of overcome by the beauty and vividness of his perception. But I think that's something that's kind of prodromal. I remember when I was in the prodrome, I also had sort of experiences of seeing things that were very vivid, like unnaturally vivid in a way, or abundantly vivid. There's a lyric by Leonard Cohen where he says, but the blues were so blue, the greens so green, or something like that. But that's kind of like what it's like. My vision flies up towards you, while youthful in your beauty, you gaze and have not grown too glorious, too dazzling and proud for me. So I think he's talking about the day, but the day also has to do with the clouds in the sky that he's seeing. Speed as you will, like come as you will, the day, I'd say, if only I could go with you, divinely ranging. But at my happy arrogance now, his arrogance about wanting to speed with the day. And it's really abstract what he's doing. He's talking, really metaphorically about these things. But at my happy arrogance now you smile. That would be like you. Rather than rambler, right? Like time, day. Bless my mortal acts, ACTS. And this day also, kindly one, brighten my quiet pathway. So he starts with a vision and he ends with with a request to be blessed by have his ACTS blessed. And then it ends so beautifully. It ends, brighten my quiet pathway. It ends so softly, just the way it starts, with dew, the lawn is glistening. Brighten my quiet pathway, right? Let's see how much time we have. Okay. So we don't have too much time left. I wanted to note that this is like a famous poem by Holderlin. This is called Bread and Wine. And you can see the form of it. But if you look at his later poems and the fragments, they're much different. And this is when he was like sort of much older and more, I don't know if you want to say sick but he wrote much differently, and he wrote in fragments instead of these sort of limpid stanzas. Now, I don't know enough about his later poetry. I think maybe we could do an episode about it another time. But I want to end by reading the first stanza of Bread and Wine, and then that'll be it for today. Let's find it. And it's a long poem, so we can't read the whole thing, but it's very, very beautiful. Where is it? Okay. And he dedicated it to his friend Hein. I think that's Heidrich Heine. I'm gonna want to get it. I don't want to get it wrong, but I believe that was another writer. Okay, Bread and Wine. And again, with poetry, they always say, don't try to make sense of it. Just appreciate the kind of music of it at first, and then later you can sort of apply your mind and intellect to it and sort of make sense of it. But first, just enjoy the music of it. Bread and Wine. Round us the town is at rest. The street, in pale lamplight, falls quiet, and, their torches ablaze, coaches rush through and away. People go home to rest, replete with the day and its pleasures, there to weigh up in their heads, pensive, the gain and the loss, finding the balance good. Stripped bare now of grapes and of flowers, as of their handmade goods, quiet the market stalls lie. But faint music of strings comes drifting from gardens. It could be someone in love who plays there, could be a man all alone thinking of distant friends, the days of his youth, and the fountains, ever welling and new, plash amid balm-breathing beds. Church bells ring. Every stroke hangs still in the quivering half-light, and the watchman calls out, mindful no less of the hour. Now a breeze rises too and ruffles the crests of the coppice. Look, and in secret our globe's shadowy image, the moon, slowly is rising too, and night, the fantastical, comes now full of stars, and I think, little concerned about us. Night, the astonishing, there, the stranger, to all that is human, over the mountain tops, mournful and gleaming, draws on. So, I don't have too much time to talk about this, but this is like the music of poetry. I mean, I read a little bit of the introduction by the translator, and he talked about the breathing of Holderlin, and it seems to be as natural and as effortless as breathing, as breath, as the wind, right? As a wind. And my favorite line, and then we'll end, is, but faint music of strings comes drifting from gardens, right? It's so lovely. And he's just describing this scene, but it's so beautiful. Anyways, I don't know if I have anything profound to say about that stanza and schizophrenia. Um, I think that too is like a vision almost. Although it's the vision is auditory as much as it is visual. I mean, it's a we call it a vision, which has to do with sight, but it's a kind of multi-sensory vision. That sounds silly, but he's hearing things and he's seeing things, and it's lilting and it's beautiful and so on and so forth. So, does living with a schizophrenia spectrum illness lend itself to experiencing such visions? I think so, yeah. um, I think when we are in these different states of mind, we see colors differently. The quality of our attention is different, especially in the prodrome. But I'm going to end for now. So thank you so much for watching, and shout out to James who suggested this video. And take care.